Hi, I am General Grudge, and welcome to the Totally Biased Comicsgate review of John Del Rio's Flying Sparks Volumes 1 and Volumes 2. That's right, it's a double your pleasure review. Spoiler alert, not quite there yet. Now, why do I call these reviews totally biased? Well, like always, I do so because they are, and like all humans, I am as well. It's best to be honest and upfront about such things so anyone who watches this can judge for themselves if I am worth listening to and if any bias I have conflicts with any biases of their own. Don't be afraid of having bias. It's just another way of saying that something is your opinion, and who else's opinion should you give other than your own? Anyway, the best way to reveal my bias in this review is to talk about the creator and what I think about him. So let's jump right in and talk about John Del Rio. My personal bias starts off with the fact that I follow John on both Twitter and YouTube. I like John a lot. I like his politics. I like his online persona, usually. And I like his work ethic. I see John as a book writer first and foremost. Whoever said the quote, "a writer writes," had to have been speaking about John Del Rio. I personally have bought about 3 of his novels. I do not have time to count how many he has written. Heck, I might not even have time to talk about how many he has written just this year. His work ethic and his tenacious ability to not procrastinate is not just something I really admire and wish I could implement in my own life, but is something that all inspiring creators, be they authors or comic book creators, should take a cue from. I first became aware of John, who dubs himself as the leading Hispanic voice in science fiction, on Twitter long ago, probably in relation to another writer and political philosopher I like named Vox Day, aka Theodore Bill. To be honest, at first I thought of him as just a wannabe or poor man's Vox Day, but over time I grew to appreciate his style and his own personality. One thing I personally couldn't help but notice was his uncanny resemblance to Andy Kaufman. I cannot confirm or deny the rumor that he is indeed Andy Kaufman and that Kaufman faked his own death and created the persona of John Del Rio just to troll SJWs on Twitter, but the evidence speaks for itself. Again, I cannot confirm or deny this rumor, but I can sure start it. John Del Rio has an online presence that is sometimes hard to understand who he actually is or if he is playing a character in order to be part showman and part provocateur. To be honest, he has sometimes entertained me, and he has also sometimes turned me off with this particular habit. I can understand why someone would use such a tactic. I can see it as being a good way of getting attention and awareness and selling some books when you're coming from out of nowhere and do not have a lot of name recognition. But that can also be a turnoff. If some are causing drama just for drama's sake, it can start to look like something out of the World Wrestling Federation and push people away because it is hard for them to know what you are or what you truly believe or not. I will admit that this did turn me away for a while, but over time I noticed that he actually showed consistency in his beliefs and stood his ground against many of the bad elements in Comicsgate. I respected that, and I realized I was wrong about him and started following him again and supporting his comic books. And that ends the totally biased part of the review. Now on to the comic books themselves, Flying Sparks Volumes 1 and Volumes 2. Spoiler alert, original and unique characters are very important. I did not back Flying Sparks 1 or 2 in either of the original crowdfunding phases. That was for multiple reasons, some like I have mentioned before, but also because while checking them out I felt like I didn't like the character designs or the artwork of the book, and I passed on them originally. Thankfully, later when I changed my mind and I decided I wished to buy them, it was very easy for me to do so. I didn't have to go to eBay and buy one used and give all my money to someone other than the creator like I did with Mike Miller's Lone Star Heart of the Hero. I was able to log into Amazon.com and conveniently buy it and have it shipped free 2-day shipping with Amazon Prime right to my door. This was incredibly convenient and will lead me to discuss how such convenience should be very important to Comicsgate and the crowdfunding movement in much more detail later in this review. But first let's get down to the nuts and bolts of the comic books themselves. Let's talk about the cover, shipping, characters, art, lettering, story, and overall value of the books. Okay. Here's the cover for the first book. To be honest, there's something about it I just do not like. The cover is credited to an artist named John Malin, and it is in a flat, motionless style that makes the character look like she's uninterested and kind of frumpy. Also, the logo just screams uninspired to me. There's not a lot here to inspire excitement if this were actually on a newsstand back in the day. But on the very first page of the book, there's a slightly better pinup that I think would have made a better cover than what John went with, but who knows. The cover for number 2 is somewhat better, but it also comes off as a bit uninspired. Still, it isn't that big a deal because these are crowdfunded books, so covers are not as important as the good old days, but it would have been nice if they were more dynamic. Now let's do characters before doing anything else, because good and original characters are one of the most important aspects to get right in crowdfunding comic books. And this is because when you're creating and self-publishing, you obviously do not have access to already established heroes and brands, so you better be able to fend for yourself. Our main character in Flying Sparks is Metagirl, aka Chloe Anderson. Chloe is a physics student and a lab assistant to Professor Fitch. This professor is a technological genius and is able to provide Chloe with the gadgets she uses and tests out as she fights crime as the heroine Metagirl. Quite frankly, I found her character design and array of abilities to be generic and uninteresting and uninspired. Yet there is more to her than just her costume and her abilities. And in her character development, John does some interesting things in this comic book story-wise. And this interesting thing is the relationship she has with the other main character, who is not a hero. In fact, he's a super-powered criminal and an underworld boss named Johnny Benavitari. Boy, that's a bit of a mouthful. I'm sure I said that wrong. Johnny is Chloe's boyfriend, though neither is aware of the other's extracurricular activities. Johnny runs a coffee shop, which is just a front for his real passion and real business, which is fencing stolen property. But that is not his only secret. You see, Johnny also has superpowers. Johnny is by far the more interesting and original of the characters, but sadly his superpower, just like Chloe's, is pretty generic. He seems to have some not well-defined shocking powers that he's developed and learned to control. The relationship between Chloe and Johnny is the most interesting part of the series. It provides a cat-and-mouse exercise in a game of hide-and-seek of truthfulness and affection. There are also a wide array of other supporting characters, another underworld character that seems inspired by Lex Luthor, and also some other friends and acquaintances of the main characters. None of these supporting characters are very interesting on their own, but they do a good job in helping the plot and the story move along. Oh, and there is also another character I should mention who appears to be a Superman-like stand-in named Meta-Man. Metagirl takes her namesake from him and is also his unofficial protege. Anyway, I feel like there's enough backstory about the characters without spoiling too much of the comic book for you, so let's move on to art, lettering, coloring, and story and overall value. Spoiler alert, the art is just plain bad, I'm sad to say. The artist for both books is named Jethro Morales, and I hate to be harsh, but his work is amateurish at best. His line work is poor, and his panel layouts are uninspiring to the eye. He draws faces with such little detailed emotion they would make a 90s image artist blush. He also seems to avoid backgrounds like they're the bubonic plague. This seems to be a typical trait of many Comicsgate artists, and since so many of them claim influence from 90s comic book artists, I can understand how it got that way. The art was so bad for me at first, I only made it halfway through the first book before having to stop and sit it down, and I didn't pick it back up until a few days later. Now while the art is not top quality for sure, like I said, it's bad, no doubt. I do not know how much of my dislike for it at first was totally objective, and how much of it was emotional on my part. This is because when I came back later, it didn't bother me as much, and I was able to finish the story. It also seemed to me like it at least got a little less rough around the edges in the second volume. But make no mistake, it still wasn't great there either. I've read online where John has claimed that the artist has learned a lot from the first two volumes and has really picked it up for the third. We will see. I want to go over the lettering and coloring really quickly while we still have the topic of the art fresh on our minds, because some of my issues with the art really affect my thought process of the story and writing. So speedily, I just want to say that the lettering was just fine and did its job. And the coloring wasn't great, but it was acceptable, especially considering the state of the artwork. Now let's dive into the story and how its flow is affected by the art style and panel layouts. The good part in writing I've already gone over a bit when I talked about the two main characters and their relationship. This is the part of the comic book that pulls it through and makes it interesting to read. At times, if I am honest, the plot and the story reminded me a little bit too much of a CW superhero TV show, but it definitely had its strong suits. But what hurts this comic the most, other than the art style, is that it feels like it was written more as a novel or a book than in the style of a comic book, and it is hard for me to know or judge if this is the fault of the writer or the artist not knowing how the book was produced. The story does not flow in the traditional style of a superhero comic book at all. Okay, let's start with the first page and try to prove our point. Please keep in mind, this is the very first page of the comic. It is literally the first introduction we get to the heroine, her world, and her powers. And on this first page, we are greeted with 4 small panels on the top and 1/2 page panel from far away. This is a very bad way to introduce a character and to start a comic book story. Ideally here I would have preferred a nice splash page of Metagirl hovering in the air in her full superhero glory. There should have been text panels around her lightly introducing to her and the scene and maybe hinting at her powers. Yet even with this change, that bottom half of the panel I mentioned before would have not have been proper even later on. It was too far away from the action and just was not dynamic enough. Unfortunately, this art style and panel problem goes throughout the whole book and rarely gets better. Okay, now for another example. Here on the last pages of Chapter 5, we see Johnny as he makes a trip to visit his dying uncle. This is a monumental scene where the reader is introduced to one of the more interesting character elements of Metagirl's boyfriend's character. Spoiler alert, and I mean it this time, this is a real spoiler alert. Jump slightly ahead if you do not want this major plot point revealed. Okay, here it is. We find out that not only is Johnny an underworld fence, but he's also the nephew of what appears to be the Don of a mafia family. And here's where we should really have a cool and cinematic Godfather-like moment of Johnny going home and entering another world and seeing something like out of the Godfather movies of a respected old Don and a lot of stereotypical but fun mafia character types like goons and underlings close to him and protected of their Don. But instead we get a scene so generic, if you'd changed the dialogue, Johnny could have very well been going to meet a dying uncle that was either a postman or a pharmacist. And it really is a colossal fail that really hurt the mood and flow of the story. And again, I have no inside information, so it is hard to tell if the fault lies in the artist or the writing. But when in doubt, blame both. And while I know this is a bit obvious and cliche, I can't help but point out that these creators should have read and implemented that old, tried and true book about making great superhero comics. And of course, I'm talking about how to make comics the Marvel way. Now, I know what you're saying. Come on, Grudge. Everybody who has wanted to be a comic book artist probably had this book since they were a kid. I know, me too. But where do you think I got this from? But just because it is old and well known doesn't make it irrelevant. Almost always the old ways and the old masters know what they're talking about. There's nothing wrong with going back to the basics and learning from what works. And let's be honest, if you want to make a superhero comic book, there's no better place to start than with this classic book. That said, while Flying Sparks fails most of the time in the call for dynamic storytelling and art, it did have a few nice shots that came close to the mark, and I would be unfair if I didn't point them out. Take this very next page after Johnny visits his uncle, which is the last page of the chapter. It actually does a really decent job of making you excited to see what happens next. Sadly, these moments are few and far between, and you are instantly marched back to the same old dull generic comic book panels. Still, all that aside for now, I wish to point out there were some very cool story points and character developments that I happened to enjoy, and that was finally enough to make me back this book on crowdfunding on Kickstarter and order Flying Sparks Volume 3. That said, unless there's a major upswing in the art of storytelling, I think the third outing might be enough for me. I'm not sure if I find the main character interesting enough to go on indefinitely. I would like to see John move on to something else and more original, either a whole new superhero character or possibly a steampunk-inspired outing considering he has a lot of experience with that setting in his book writing. I also can't help but think one of his latest books would make an interesting comic book universe, and that is his Christian-inspired space opera Justified, the saga of the Nano Templar. But I don't know. John might really bring it home in Flying Sparks 3, or do something else I never expected that is awesome. Only time will tell. And honestly, I could see John being a good editor back in the day at one of the big traditional comic book companies. His dedication and hard work and common sense on what should and should not be done with the characters would have been a good fit. If I had a few $1 billion laying around, I might buy the rights to print, say, Marvel Comics Universe and set good old John Delarez up as my editor-in-chief. That's unlikely to happen, though it might be slightly more likely than one of the current SJW-infested publishers to wise up and hire someone like John to come in and save their business, I'm sad to say. Now, as I wrap this review up, I want to close with a revelation that I came to while buying and reading John's books that I think is very important, and I want everyone in the crowdfunding movement to think about what I'm about to say, especially the creators, and consider it carefully, and use reason and a business mindset instead of being emotional and keeping their thinking trapped in old and traditional, outdated business models. I want to point out just how easy it was for me to buy and try John's comic books, even though I missed out on the original crowdfunding campaigns. You can do something with John's business model that is impossible with any other major figures in Comicsgate, with the obvious exception of Vox Day. Of course, the thing that I'm talking about is the easy access to the product through a mainstream service like Amazon.com. When the whim finally hit me that I was interested in trying out Flying Sparks, I didn't have to back a campaign tier of all 3 books and then silently wait for the campaign to be over and then for the creators to finish the newest book and wait for all 3 books to be shipped to me and then hope I liked them. I was able, when the whim hit me, to pop by Amazon.com and order the trade paperbacks I wanted, and they were literally on my doorstep 2 days later. Just think about how pro-consumer that is and also how pro-creator the process is. I've already mentioned why it is great for me as the consumer, but let's look at the perks that the creator would have as well. Not long ago, I decided I wanted to back and try out Mike Miller's Lone Star comic because it looked like something that was right up my alley, so I jumped right in and I did so. Of course, the problem with doing so is that this was not the first outing the character has had, and I didn't back the first campaign. To remedy this, I eventually went to eBay and ordered a copy of the book there. So the problem on the creator side for this should be obvious. When I bought that used back issue, the creator did not get any of that money at all. I assume Mike understood that such a thing is an issue because right after I bought my copy on eBay, I noticed that he coincidentally started a new campaign where you could buy a reprint of Lone Star, Heart of the Hero. From a business perspective, it is obvious how this is not the most optimal option for either the creator or the consumer. Mike is forced to list a second Indiegogo while he already has still one going. Then he has to pay to reprint and ship all these books to new backers, all hopefully and preferably before they get a copy of the next part of the series. How much better would it be if he were able to use crowdfunding to support the initial launch and printing of his comic books, but afterward, if new customers want to read the story and experience the characters, they could go to a trusted mainstream source and buy it after the fact there. Not only is this process more pro-consumer, but it creates another revenue stream for the creator from his work that he always gets a piece of, which he would not get from eBay, and doesn't create any new work or cost for him. Now, obviously, I, as a regular customer, am not involved in any area of the business part of any of these crowdfunded products, so what I'm saying might be a pipe dream on many levels, but honestly don't see why this wouldn't work out. If the business model I'm proposing is actually sound like I imagine it would be, I can only think of two mindsets holding back many non-war campaign affiliated Comicsgate creators from trying it. Those two mindsets are collector values and old grudges and prejudices. Let's tackle the easier and less controversial one first, and that is the resale or collector's value argument. I can't help but feel some creators are trapped in the old but obviously flawed idea of not wanting their work to be easily accessible after the campaign is funded under the illusion that it will hurt its collectible value. This is an insane mindset for them to operate from. They should never limit the profitability and availability of their creations on the unlikely possibility that someone who bought their comic on Indiegogo or someplace will be able to resell it at an exuberant price later. First off, you do not profit from that exchange at all, and it is unwise to encourage any speculator market when it comes to comic books at all. Did we learn nothing from the false boom and greedy bubble of the comic book companies created during the 90s by caving into card collector speculators that invaded and ruined comic book collecting? Do you not remember how multiple covers and full cover atrocities and the reissued and needless number 1 issues ruined the goodwill these companies had with their customers and created consumer fatigue? How many people left the community after feeling these companies were just using them as piggybacks? And if any consumers are just supporting these crowdfunding project campaigns because they are delusional that it is some kind of wise investment, you are not doing them or yourselves any favors by playing into it. We need to face the fact that the current crowdfunding community is relatively small. The whole business model, actually, is already scaringly close to a pseudo-pyramid scheme. I can't help but wonder if the consumer side is either just speculators or want to be comic book creators who are just along for the ride to either flip their purchase on eBay or to try to get into position to do their own crowdfunding campaigns. What happens when the inevitable comes to call and the consumers who have been buying bulk tiers learn that demand isn't as high as they had hoped, or wannabe creators learn the same thing, but they learn it the harder way? I will tell you what happens. The whole movement collapses. Personally, I desperately do not want to see this happen. I do not buy comic books to resell. I buy them to enjoy them. And I do not have any crowdfunding campaign of my own to shill. I am just a fan that loves comic books and knows that the mainstream comic book companies are on their last legs and are destined to fall. If I want to continue having access to this hobby that I have loved my entire life, I need for Comicsgate to survive and to outlast the dinosaurs of DC and Marvel Comics. Our numbers are small, and they logically cannot grow by crowdfunding alone. Your books need to be available where consumers can find them and access them easier. Do not make the fatal mistake comic companies made long ago, which led to their inevitable decline when they put all their eggs in the direct market basket for that quick and greedy easy cash, but hid their comics from the world and didn't create any new consumers. Their death was a slow process, but here we are. Not even with huge blockbuster comic book movies everywhere in the world were they able to attract new customers to their hobby. Now on to the more controversial issue, the one where I'm probably just wasting my breath and pissing into the wind. And that is addressing the fact that many creators need to put their bruised egos aside and to end their grudges with other like-minded creators and overcome prejudices and misunderstandings that they have only because of lies and propaganda from War Campaign and its obvious leader, Ethan Van Sciver. They need to be intelligent and make smart business decisions of working together and being more pro-consumer, and do like John Delros does and make their comics easily or more accessible for anyone at any time. Now I could see or understand why they would cling to the old outdated mindset of just using crowdfunding if there was no other option. It would be incredibly hard to move away from it if you had to create your own publishing house and your own contracts and other outlets to get your products to the masses. But you don't have to. This avenue already exists. I saw it already when I bought John's books on Amazon.com through the publisher Dark Legion Comics. It already exists and it already works, and it is pro-consumer and pro-growth. If it's feasible that more indie comics can join in with them, why wouldn't you do it? Now I know what some are going to say. That company is related somehow to Vox Day, and I heard from people like Ethan Van Sciver and War Campaign and other mainstream media sources that he is a bad guy in such way, blah blah nonsense, whatever. But I say you were wrong, and I say those are SJW lies. I have read and followed him probably around 20 years, at least since the old WorldNet Daily days where I found his column there, and he is not the villain he is portrayed as. And even if you have some ideological differences from him, why should that matter? We all have political and religious differences with people all the time, but that does not necessarily mean we should have no dealing with them, especially if those dealings are better for us financially and better for our customers and better for our hobby as a whole. And personally, I can't help but feel if you put your prejudices and egos aside, you will find that you all have a lot more in common than you do not. That said, I don't know any of these people or their business models and capabilities personally, so I do not know if this is feasible, but I would sure hope that the movers and shakers on both sides would at least start the conversation. I see no reason why elements like Ethan Van Sciver and War Campaign's lies should keep such a partnership from happening. Anyway, man, that turned into quite a tangent and one hell of a rant. I should probably put all these thoughts into their own separate video, but I didn't. This review is getting too long, I should probably call it a night. So once again, I'm General Grudge, and this has been Totally Biased Comicsgate Reviews. Thanks for watching, and if you don't mind, like and share this video. As always, I enjoyed making this video, so I will make more. If all goes as planned, I will review Mike S. Miller's Lone Star, Heart of the Hero next. Hope to see you then. Bye.